1988 animated film, The Land Before Time, was a children's adventure film by Steven Spielberg and George Lucas about 5 very young dinosaurs who, while very different from one another, traveled on a great journey together through their own apocalypse. Now, as a child, this was one of my favorite films. I remember pulling the VHS cassette tape out and watching it on our family's VHS player, and yes, I do remember what those are. They were around when I was a kid. And I watched it over and over in my family's living room. It was the film that probably began for me my own theological ponderings about why dinosaurs weren't in the Bible. Listen, as a 6-year-old, that really concerned me. I think I'm joking. Now, in the story, the characters had to make their way through volcanoes and meteors, famines, harsh weather, and even escape a dangerous Tyrannosaurus Rex, who, whenever it found the opportunity, attempted to harm them as they traveled to the Great Valley, their very own Garden of Eden that had been spared from destruction, that would allow all dinosaurs to live in safety and harmony together. They had never seen this great valley, but they knew of it, and they believed in it even when believing in it was hard. The story was meant to teach children about the adversity and prejudices of life and help them understand that they could overcome them. Each of the dinosaur characters is a different species. There's a brontosaurus-like one, the main one, named Littlefoot. There's a triceratops named Sarah, a stegosaurus named Spike, a Saurolophilus, I think that's how you say it, named Ducky, and a Petrodon named Petrie. Each of them were taught by their parents at a very young age that they were not allowed to play together. And they couldn't really do anything together because that's just not how it was. They were different. So they had to be separate. But because of their terrible circumstances, they were forced to unite and make it to the Great Valley together. Now, as you might guess, they go through a great deal of strife and hardship as they're separated from their families and they work against the elements and against these other dinosaurs that might harm them so they can make it to this new and wonderful place that, again, they've never seen, they've never been to, they've only been told about it. The Great Valley is one where harmony ensues. Dinosaurs of all different kinds live together in peace. There's no more prejudice. There's plenty of food for everyone. It's safe. New little dinosaurs won't be born into worlds of famine or disaster. They will be born in a new time and place. And the assumption is that there's no T-Rex or other harmful dinosaur that might be there to take the life of another. All is well in the Great Valley. Now, in our passages this morning, we've got a bit of apocalyptic language happening here. Normally, we don't think of apocalyptic language as something that we find throughout the Bible. We normally think about it in Revelation, but the fact is, this language is woven throughout our scriptures, and for the most part, it's not something we always see in a positive light, based on our cultural and our historical experiences with things like the book of Revelation. But Isaiah the prophet has a pretty positive spin on what's to come, on the future that God is creating. It's not scary, in fact, it's quite beautiful. It's a place that any of us would want to live in. Isaiah calls God's new creation, and in it, people will be rejoicing. There will be long life, there will be safe places to live and vineyards to cultivate food, and people won't have to labor in vain for no reason. And my favorite part of what Isaiah says about this is that no more are they going to have children who are born to the horrors of the world. Imagine that. Children being born into a world where there's no wars, there's no poverty, there's no homelessness, there's no mass shootings, there's no climate change, no children locked in cages at the border or families being separated, there's no racism or homophobia, none of that. Doesn't exist. Things are going to be great. All that bad stuff won't exist anymore, and we're going to live in peace because God is creating a new thing. And it's going to be our own kind of great valley. This is a passage we can get behind and that we can have hope from. But then we have our Luke passage. And hope is a little harder to find. Jesus doesn't paint the beautiful and hopeful picture that Isaiah does. He's a bit of a downer in how he describes things because he knows that before God's kingdom is ushered in, before we get our great valley, things are going to get worse before they get better. He knows about the tribulations his followers will face. He knows that his teachings have made people in power very angry because they go against so much of society that is already in place. And if and when his followers really live out his teachings, they will be persecuted for challenging the status quo. It's going to be a long and tough journey, but they must hold on to faith as they make their way towards God's peaceable kingdom on earth. Jesus knows that for change to happen, for this new and peaceful creation of God to come, hard decisions will have to be made on the part of his followers. The path for following Jesus has never truly been a simple or easy path. He warns that things are going to get difficult. There will be wars and earthquakes and famines and epidemics, events that will change the whole world and affect thousands. And then he warns what will happen to those who follow him and keep to God's way. They will be imprisoned because of their beliefs. They will be betrayed by the ones they love, even their own family members, and some of them will even lose their lives for what they believe. Being a true follower of Jesus will come with consequences because things will get bad, really bad, before they become better. This Luke passage is oftentimes the type of passage that gets quoted by televangelists and doomsday preparers. For instance, when the attacks on September 11th happened, Jerry Falwell went on the evangelical television show The 700 Club and claimed that the attacks were the fault of organizations and people within our own country that allowed for alternative lifestyles to be promoted, and that this was a sign of the coming apocalypse. Or when an Australian priest wrote in a newsletter to his parish that Hurricane Katrina was New Orleans' punishment because of its immense immorality. You know the kind of people I'm talking about. Think like Westboro Baptist Church, the family church that believes the end of times is near, and we've gotten to the point where we're such terrible people and do such abominable things in the sight of God that we're being punished, and that we're ultimately ushering in God's apocalypse to suffer God's wrath upon us for eternity. Sounds great, right? Now, the problem with the theology of people like Mr. Falwell and the Westboro Church is that they fail to take into account that God's new creation for humanity, where peace and harmony prevail, is not ushered in by God alone or by Jesus. It's ushered in by us too. And this new creation of God's kingdom on earth, well, we know from what Jesus says that it is going to be difficult for sure, because anytime we start to make changes, it's hard. But with hard work, we can bring about great and wonderful new things. Their theology fails to acknowledge that this new thing God is creating is going to happen because of the work we do in God's name through our active participation. See, that is one of the beautiful things about God. God does things in relationship with us. We were created to be co-creators with God and of new things in the world. But again, that doesn't ever mean it's going to be easy. At the time when Isaiah would have prophesied these words, God's people were beginning to return from exile, and they faced the gigantic task of rebuilding the destroyed city of Jerusalem. Unlike in Luke's passage, the temple in Jerusalem had not been rebuilt yet. There was much work to be done, and so it is fitting that Isaiah would use words such as these to help move the people into action. Jerusalem, the holy center of faith, would be restored by their efforts. Everyone would see this city on a hill, shining forth into a world as a place of peace, of justice, of righteousness. No longer were they going to be an oppressed people in exile. Instead, they were going to rejoice in their freedom and in the promises that God had laid out for them. They were going to have homes and vineyards. They would have better health and live longer lives because they had a safe place to live and work where they were able to enjoy the fruit of their labors. They would create this new place where things were different, and they were going to build it. They were going to have to create peace and righteousness and justice in this new place. But if their children were going to be born into a world where there were no bad things happening, they were going to have to make some significant changes from how things had been. And it's the same with us. It is possible that we too could live in a place like this. If we want our children to grow up in a world where mass shootings are no longer the norm, where homelessness and disease are eradicated, where no longer do a tiny percentage of the human population control most of the resources in our world, where white supremacy no longer runs free in our communities, if we want to live into this new creation that Isaiah is prophesying about, we have to create it ourselves. And that can only happen by change, but before we can get there, we have to get rid of all of those other things that plague our world. If we really want this peaceful place on earth for all people to live in, we're going to have to live into our co-creator status with God to become the new Jerusalem, the place where righteousness and justice prevail, where famine is no more. But we cannot live into that co-creator role as God's people without also taking seriously Jesus' words of warnings. In his book, Dear Church, Lutheran pastor Lenny Duncan says that the work towards eradicating the things that plague our world, especially the things that plague our churches, will not be easy. In fact, facing racism, he says, in our churches is going to be an uphill battle. It's going to hurt a lot, especially for people who benefit from being in places of power, because it's going to mean facing things about ourselves that we don't much care for and admitting that we have allowed ourselves to go on like this. We have perpetuated the oppression of others in first and secondhand ways, and he says it means admitting that we benefit from racist systems. What eradicating the bad things in our world also means is that when we start to make those changes to usher in God's justice and peace where it didn't exist before, is that we're going to have to make a lot of people mad. People who profit off of things like war, who make money off of detention centers and prisons and building walls, people who have staked their livelihoods in this world atop the systems of oppression that so much is built upon. That is what Jesus is warning us about. He's talking about all those that will fight to keep those harmful systems in place because they benefit from them. Actively working towards God's new creation will make those people mad because it will threaten their ways of living off the backs of others, of profiting off of the pain and labor of others. What it means is that if we want to end mass shootings, we're going to have to take on people like the wealthy and powerful NRA that works to keep guns readily accessible in our country. It means that we want to ensure that all people have access to basic health care. We're going to have to take on the wealthy insurance industry that only so few in our country can actually afford to buy into. It means if we want to eradicate racism, we are going to have to admit that we continually benefit from racist systems and get rid of them and build new, equitable systems in their place. It means if we want to be welcoming to all people, regardless of race or ability, of gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and whatever else it is that sets us apart, we're going to have to take a long, hard look at ourselves to make changes happen in our own spaces to build this new creation that Isaiah prophesies. Ushering in God's new creation, our new Jerusalem, is going to be hard no matter when we do it. And like Jesus said, these things won't happen overnight. It's going to be a journey. Things in our world will have to be torn down, just like the temple in Jerusalem. And we're going to have to look towards doing some serious rebuilding in the future. And it's going to take a lot of time and energy. And yes, people will betray us as we work towards this new creation. Some people will even try to hurt us to ensure that they continue to profit off of things like prisons and guns and white supremacy and racism, who benefit from withholding medical care for those who can't afford it, some people will hate us because we will tell the world that God loves all people, and that will challenge their viewpoint that God just doesn't love the straight white people who sit in churches every other Sunday. Co-creating God's new creation is going to be just like Isaiah and Jesus both proclaim. It will be glorious in the end for sure, but the tearing down and the building up of our world to get there is going to be the hardest thing that we as God's people can ever do. In May of 2016, the U.S. government put out a document called a white paper that dealt with how countries could make economic reparations, truth commissions, and memorial building. It was an endorsement for truth and reconciliation processes similar to the ones that have taken place in places like Cambodia and South Africa. But as a New York Times writer says, while it is a statement endorsing such processes, it is only endorsed for other countries, not for us. It is something that others should do in order to make reparations to those that have been harmed, not for us. But what if it really is for us? What if we did make reparations to people of color that have been marginalized and targeted with violence? What if we did make reparations to women who only make 79 cents to every $1 a man makes? What if we started to make reparations on our own systems that are broken and inequitable? How would our world here be a more just and righteous place if we did these things? I would dare to say that these are the kind of things. This is the kind of work we would need to begin to do in order for God's new creation to start to take shape within our own communities. The thing that we know to be true is that we are capable of making God's new creation actually happen here on earth. But we also know the truth of how hard it's going to be. We can't let us stop that because things won't change at all if we don't. Like the dinosaurs from the land before time, we have to come together on our journey despite what the world has taught us about our differences. We have to overcome the things in the world that might separate us, that would harm us, that would put us in different classes if we want to get to the place that Isaiah foretells of. But we must do it. No one else is going to make it happen for us. In recent years, the Dr. Seuss book, The Lorax, has seen a bit of a revival. You may even have seen the film. What was once just a colorful children's book about the Lorax and the trees has now become a battle cry for the earth and for all of creation. The Lorax is the character that speaks for the trees because they cannot speak for themselves. And he confronts the character, the Onceler, who comes to town and creates needs out of the trees. Needs are these items that have endless versatility and are sold cheap. This new cash income inspires the Onceler to make needs that people don't really need. And in doing so, he destroys the home of the animals that live there, causing destruction for his own personal gain. And his relatives come to work for him because they get paychecks. But when they run out of forests, they run out of cash. And the relatives leave the Onceler, and he is left all alone to ponder the final words of the Lorax. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Friends, the Lorax is right. Unless people like us care a whole lot, unless we do something to make changes in our world, nothing will change. This new creation of God won't magically appear out of thin air. It's not how it works. Unless we begin to challenge the things that oppress others, that keep us from living out God's kingdom here on earth, God's new creation will never be known to us or anyone else except only in prophecies. So if we believe in the reality of God's new creation, then let us live into this great ability that we have been given as co-creators, with Jesus' teachings as our guide and the hope we find in our God, so that we can all live into this place where war is no more, where children are born into peaceful places, where everyone has enough, where, as Isaiah says, the wolf and lamb will lie down together in peace, where those who cause destruction will do so no more, and where God will be able to forever rejoice in the goodness of God's people and the good work that we have brought about. May it be so in our futures. Amen.